In a remote corner of the world, nestled among snow-capped mountains, there stood a small weathered log cabin near a lake at the edge of a vast forest. This was home to old Henry, a woodcutter, who had once been surrounded by love and laughter. But time had taken those he cherished most, leaving him with nothing but memories and the stillness of the forest. Each day, Henry would chop wood and drive down to the town square to sell it. He spoke little and had few friends. The only visitors he ever had were the birds that would eat the bird seeds Henry kept for them, and the deer that occasionally wandered close. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire, listening to the howling wind. Though he had grown accustomed to the solitude, a quiet ache of loneliness lingered in his heart. In the town below, life moved on, indifferent to the old man's existence. On the main street, outside a small grocery store, there was another soul who knew the sting of loneliness. An old mongrel, grizzled and gray, spent his days curled up on the cold concrete, waiting for scraps from kind strangers. His once vibrant fur was matted, his eyes clouded with age, and his limbs stiff with arthritis. The townsfolk had grown used to the sight of him, a creature who had been forgotten by time, much like old Henry. One harsh winter day, as the first heavy snow began to fall, the town's shopkeepers decided that the old dog could no longer stay outside. The bitter cold would surely be his end. They shooed him away, hoping he would find some place warm, but in their hearts, they doubted he would survive the night. The dog, driven by an instinct he couldn't understand, began to wander. The streets grew quieter as he limped further from the town, leaving behind the only life he had known. He didn't know where he was going. All he knew was that he needed to keep moving. As night fell, the snowstorm grew fiercer. Old Henry, stoking the fire in his cabin, heard a faint whimper at his door. He hesitated, for it had been years since anyone, or anything, had come calling. When he opened the door, there stood the old mongrel, shivering and covered in snow. Their eyes met, and in that moment, two lonely beings found an unspoken connection. Without a word, Henry stepped aside, and the dog hobbled in, collapsing gratefully by the warmth of the fire. Henry fetched an old blanket and draped it over the dog, his heart softening as the animal sighed contentedly. Days turned into weeks, and the harsh winter raged on outside. Inside the cabin, however, a bond had formed. The dog, who Henry named Rusty, had brought life back to the old man's quiet existence. They became inseparable companions, each finding comfort in the other's presence. Henry spoke to Rusty as if he were an old friend, sharing stories of his past, his lost loved ones, and the dreams he once had. Rusty, though he couldn't speak, seemed to understand. He would rest his head on Henry's knee, offering the kind of silent companionship that words could never provide. As spring arrived and the snow melted away, Henry and Rusty ventured outside more often, exploring the forest together. The world that had once felt so empty to Henry now seemed full of life. And the ache of loneliness that had once plagued him faded with each passing day. Rusty's time, however, was nearing its end. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Rusty laid his head in Henry's lap and took his last breath. Henry felt a deep sorrow, but also a profound gratitude. Rusty had given him the gift of companionship when he needed it most, and in doing so, had filled his final days with warmth and love. In the years that followed, Henry would often sit by the fire, thinking of Rusty and the bond they had shared. He no longer felt alone, for the memory of his old friend remained with him. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, companionship can be found in the most unexpected places.